All right. No, probably gotta do it like
Uh-huh.
something like that.
Well, thank
And
you,
you're on.
Ms.
Yeah.
Crum. Your teacher, Roderick Watson, Dr. Watson, well, Mr. Watson asked me to come in and talk with you since I work for the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. And I've worked there about 12 years. I also worked in consulting in the private sector before that. I went to Ohio State University and got a degree in geology and mineralogy. And then I went on for a master's degree in natural resource development. So I have some training. I grew up in Worthington and graduated from high school there. So that's a little background on me. Where I work now is in the central district office. The state is set up into 5 districts. And then we each have a group of counties that we work on projects in the state in those areas. And then we have a central office that manages all those districts. So I'm in a district and central Ohio. So I work in this area and we have projects in this area. So I thought what I'd do today is give you a little overview on one of our programs and then mention some of the other programs. The EPA was started, as you can see here, last year was our 40th year. So in 1972 or so, the US EPA started and Ohio EPA started shortly after that. And I don't know if you've studied the US EPA, why they came into existence. Has anyone heard about Love Canal before? Have you done any research on that? No, okay. There was an area where a company dumped lots of chemicals and it ended up that people put their houses over that area. And it was contaminated, people were getting sick. So they studied it and decided they needed to create an agency in the federal government to address that area. And so the US EPA was born. And they've addressed that, and I think there even today, there's some areas outside that are back in the news. So if you read the news sometimes, you'll see information about Love Canal. Might be something to look up someday. But Ohio EPA, we have a program that started, it's called the Voluntary Action Program. And I'm just going to give an overview. This was prepared by somebody else. But you see on the left, there's an old factory. And then you see on the right, there's new residential housing. So a lot of these old sites are being redeveloped into a new use and more productive use. So I'm with the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization. And the VAP, or as we call it, the Voluntary Action Plan Program, is one of our programs. Let's have the next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of history of the VAP. It started back in 1994. I don't know when you guys were born, but maybe after that. So it's been here a while. We started with a bill, and that bill was approved by the legislature, and they developed a law. Now, what we call laws, the Ohio Revised Code, the ORC, is what a law is, or it's also referred to as a statute. So agencies kind of work, they have laws that tell them what they need to do, and then they create rules, the Ohio Administrative Code. And those are kind of like the specifics of what needs to be done, what has to be complied with. I know you've talked about non-compliance or a site that's not doing what they need to do. That's kind of where the rules come in. So we have a statute, has law, and then we have rules for this program. So the program is a voluntary program. This is, usually you hear the EPA coming down on a company, that they're required to do something. Here, this is totally a voluntary program where we've kind of partnered with a volunteer, someone who's come into us and says, I want to do the right thing. I want to clean up my site to meet certain standards. So this is an opportunity for them to do that. And the volunteer can come in, they can ask us technical questions, and that's a lot of what I do. I answer their technical questions to see how they're complying with the rules and what they need to do to meet those requirements. They may not meet them right now, but they're working towards meeting those requirements. Okay. So it tells you what a volunteer is. They may be an owner of the property. They may be a developer. We have a lot today that developers are interested in. You've probably seen downtown where factories have gone away, old buildings have gone away, and they've developed new ones. So there's a lot of money involved by the developers. Sometimes we have a city that's interested in the property. So they partner with the city. The city is also able to get grants, federal and state monies to perform work like this, cleanups. Or it may be a responsible party. There may be a factory there that's still operating, but they have a historic legacy there. They have an old contamination problem that they want to resolve. And then sometimes there's leases that would come in. So it's a privatized program. It works with volunteers. We have environmental professionals. Like I said, I work for a consulting firm historically. A lot of those consultants now are trained to become certified professionals in this program. And then we have laboratories that do the testing, the analytical testing, laboratory testing, and they're certified to meet certain requirements that we've established for them. Next one. Like I mentioned, technical assistance, they can come in and before they're ready to submit and no further action letter to us, meaning that they've complied with everything, the certified professional is signed off and everything looks good, they're submitting it to us, to the EPA. They want our director to issue them a covenant not to sue, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we can make sure that they're ready to meet those requirements before they officially submit it. And one of the reasons is we have to be paid for our work too, so they agree to pay us our costs to do this technical review work. So here's kind of a picture. I don't know, agencies would like to have flow charts and pictures. I don't know if you've seen that in different ways. That you follow the arrows and kind of gets you from the start to the finish. So here, these are kind of the components that's part of a VAP project. We have a phase 1 property assessment where they kind of give the history of the property. There's a walkover that's performed by the environmental professional to see what's there today. And then they determine areas that may have contamination. Now, they don't really do any physical work other than walk over the property. Then that takes you to the phase 2, if that's necessary. Phase 1 says, yeah, there might be a reason to see, there might be contamination there. That's when they do the sampling, design how to take samples of environmental media. Let's say there be soil, shallow or deep soil, groundwater, surface water, sometimes air. So there's different media that they might sample here. And then they would decide what standards they compare it to. Those are established in the voluntary action program. You have a list of standards that you would compare it to see if you're above or below. And if you're above, then some type of cleanup needs to be done. And that's where the remediation, that's the term we use for site cleanup essentially. And they have to meet VAP standards. So they may treat it, let's say you have a pond that has contaminants in it, like zinc or something. They may mix something with it to keep the zinc from going into the groundwater or going into sediments. Or they may dig it up and remove it to a licensed landfill. That's an option too. So they have ways of doing it. They can control exposure. Exposure's like, let's say there's soil on the ground that has lead in it. And you know that lead can be bad for you at certain levels. So to keep you from getting exposed to it, from eating it or getting it on your skin, they may put a cap on it. They may put 2 foot of soil above that. So you can't really get to it. It's still there, but you're not being exposed to it. You're being protected from it. So that's kind of an engineering type control. You could put a parking lot over it, and then you're not going to be exposed to it. And then they have to maintain that parking lot through an O&M agreement with us. And they have to have money set aside to fix it if it ever gets cracks in it, that type of thing. So then they would issue this, certified professional would issue this no further action letter. And then it would come to us. They'd have to submit it to the director, who's kind of in charge of our Ohio EPA. We have a director. Next slide, please. And this tells you what kind of things are in the no further action letter. It's not really just a piece of paper that's a letter. It's more like, I think, volumes that has that phase 1 report, that phase 2. It talks about the remedy, and then it has an operation and maintenance plan and other documents in it. So it may be a whole box, maybe a file box of materials. Even though it's called a letter, there's a lot more to it. So if we determine all that data they submit us meets the standards and we're comfortable with it, then a covenant not to sue is issued by the director. We recommend it to the director and he signs it. And what it means is that the state's not going to come back to that volunteer and sue them for what they've done. we determine it meets standards, you know, it's okay, they get this release of liability, they call it. I know it sounds legal and all that, but essentially, we're not gonna go after them to clean it up again, because they've cleaned it up to meet certain standards. And hopefully, yes, the federal government will not come after them for the same thing. They've kind of agreed that it meets the state requirements, so they're not gonna waste their resources on it. So that tells you what the covenant, I mean, these are more legal terms, civil liability. And then this can go on to the future. Let's say the developer wants to sell the property. So he may be able to sell the property, he or she could sell the property to another owner. And then they would take over the operation, maintenance, and keep the remedy in place. They'd have requirements to do that. So it is recorded like a deed, so it stays with the property. Okay, I think we're done with that one. We'll shut that program down. There is insurance to maintain these covenants. But I just want to give you an overview of what the BAP is, because a lot of our projects go that way. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those sites that's just down the road. Does anyone know what Columbus Auto Parts is? Let's see. Let's go to that. How about the links? Yeah, we'll go to the first one. This is our website for Ohio EPA, something you can plug in and you can find out all about the agency. It tells about, let's go to about maybe. I think one of your questions was, what is the EPA? What do they do? Well, here's the definition right here for your answer. So, we're a trusted leader in the environment, using innovative quality service and public involvement to ensure a safe, healthy environment for all Ohioans. So essentially, we protect the environment and public health by ensuring compliance with environmental laws and demonstrating leadership in environmental stewardship. So we're talking about meeting these environmental laws right now. Okay. We can close that. Let's go to this. No, sorry. Go to the second one. Now, I mentioned I work for Central District Office. I wanted to go to our website. We have these site summaries available for all projects that are completed in our counties. And you'll see these are cleanup lists. A lot of these are, I might not recognize too many, but they're sites that are under kind of a regulatory requirement. If we keep scrolling down, we have site assessments where we've gone and done an investigation. We've looked at the environmental media there. We've taken samples. So we have reports on those. So let's keep going. We have some cleanup sites down here. Voluntary action program. We're going to go to Columbus Auto Parts right there. Click on that. Now this site is on Hudson Avenue. It's right across from 71. We'll scroll down, there's like 30 acres. This tells you who the volunteer was, who owns the property, who the certified professionals were, the laboratories, certified laboratories. And then it gives a little information of when this was done. It was done in 2000, so almost 13 years ago. And it tells you what's there. There's a interim remedy. That we talked about that 2 feet of soil. That's something that's in place there. There are engineering controls. So there must be pavements out there. And there's reporting requirements that are required every year. So this is what the site looked like. We have some pictures here. The site was called the Columbus Auto Parts site. We used to make parts for automobiles. Even before 71 was there, I think. So we'll scroll down.
Was it that they were doing something wrong?
Well, it closed down, and they left like pits of oil and other contaminants at the site. It was kind of abandoned. As you can see, it kind of fell apart in disrepair. And there was material on the ground that they had to clean up, and they also had to protect people. So now you recognize it has been redeveloped. There are new places there now that you can see there's restaurants. So it's one of our sites, but it's usable today. It's being used for other purposes.
So when you say they had lead, when you say they did something where they covered up the soil, so you said one thing is there's contaminants and then they put a parking lot over it.
Right.
That's what they did.
And it was petroleum. There's a lot of oils, cutting oils, things like that they used in their process historically.
So that oil that's under that pavement, that doesn't get into the groundwater under it?
Well, I think they removed a lot of the oil. It might just be in the soil now, so they covered the soil so you don't get exposed to it. I think there's still maybe some, some of the oil in the soil yet. But they have pavements over areas that they have to keep every 5 years we check. They have to report every year to us, so. And that's Lowe's there, you might recognize that too. So I want to give you an idea of what, here's the covenant not to sue we talked about and the O&M agreement. They're available to look at if you're ever interested in that site. Yeah, we'll go back to, I think the next one I want to talk about is actually a PDF. Yeah, we'll try that one. Okay.
This one?
Yeah, we can do that one. Let's see what time it is. Okay. This site, I think it's called Sarco. It's you may notice we're kind of up here, I think. This is Joyce Avenue. I think there's a number of industries over in that area. This one's been torn down, but historically, it was an area that they used zinc. It was a zinc smelter, they called it. And there's information on it, but I wanted to show you where it is. There's actually a couple sites here, and then there's a ditch that runs off-site that also has been impacted with zinc that we found. So we actually have two sites. We have the former site where the factory was, and then where the factory drained.
Is the zinc still there?
The zinc is still on the ground and in the sediments.
How does the zinc affect us if it gets in our?
Well, we have to look at the health effects of that. We can. What I want to talk about a little bit is what happened at this site and what's going on now. There are other pictures that show, where the samples were taken and that type of thing. But I have a history here that this began as a brick factory in the 1900s. So there's several hundred years there. Zinc oxide was used in the 1920s through 1986. So it had a long history of operating. It also used acids like sulfuric acid. That was one of the contaminants in zinc. So they closed the facility in 1997 and then kind of abandoned it. The company itself went through bankruptcy. Does anyone know what that means? Or?
They ran out of money.
Yeah. Right. There was some money they were able to recover, and they put that in a set aside for cleaning up the site. And they're trying to develop a way to spend that effectively now, because they have to clean up the sediments off property, but yet there's still a landfill that's left here on property. They covered it up, but it's still leaking out a little bit. So that's one thing they're going to spend their money on. So today, we're working on getting that site cleaned up. Oh, we lost our pictures. Does anyone have any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Sort of? Okay. So this is the Sarco site and the American Ditch site we were just talking about. I think it came to our attention back in 1990. So it's been a while. They tried to go through the voluntary program, but we had some issues with that. They ran out of money when they went through bankruptcy, so they couldn't complete their cleanup. So today we're looking at kind of focusing the cleanup investigation. So they're going through more of a modified process where they're kind of splitting the two different sites up and deciding how to remedy them. Probably have to address this site first so it doesn't continue to contaminate the off-property area.
What street is this? Oh, this is Joyce.
This is on Joyce. I have an address to it. Well, it's Joyce and Woodland and Maryland Avenue. And then we have an address on Windsor Avenue. So it's a pretty large area, yes.
Joyce Avenue also had Plascolite. Was both of those going on at the same time?
Plascolite, as I understand, is still in business today. And let's see if I can find any information on that. I looked up Plascolite. It wasn't one in our database right away. But there are other programs that they're subject to, like we have a surface water program. and they have a non-point discharge elimination system permit. So if they're discharging to surface water, it's usually permitted. So they have a certain level they're allowed to discharge. Same with air. If they have air emissions, we have a division of air pollution control, and there's a permit that they have to meet those standards. Now, if they exceed it, then they might be in violation, and they'd have to fix that. It might be an engineering fix or something like that that would scrub the air or prevent the amount of contamination from leaving the site. So there are permits. I have a link to permits on Joyce Avenue where I can show you some of those areas. Let's see. If we go to that link sheet here, this one right here, stormwater permits. Let's see if that opens. But what it's going to show you is a Google map, and it'll show you areas over here, wherever we are, where's Bexley. We're kind of in this area. But each one of these has a name of a company and kind of what the permit is that they have. It may be a surface water permit or an air permit. I think these are all industrial wastewater discharges.
Can you say what a surface water permit is?
What it is, they're permits that tell you how much contamination you're allowed to discharge, how much of a metal is acceptable, not to pose an adverse health effect, essentially. You're allowed to discharge a certain amount, and if you exceed that, then you have to fix your process, you're in violation of your permit.
So you can put out a little bit of pollution, but not too much.
You can put out a little bit of metals, let's say, as long as it's within an acceptable range that doesn't adversely impact people or the environment. So it's a permitted use. So it allows factories to operate, but yet they're not really putting out the contamination that's unmonitored.
Right.
Like they have in the past. So I guess I wanted to get that concept across, that even though factories are still operating, they're still allowed to discharge material into the atmosphere. Yes?
The only association you have?
With classical light? I looked up where they are and what they do on the website. I did not have it as a site because it's probably still operating. So it's probably administered by one of our other programs.
Right.
Which I know there is a water discharge permit for it.
Right, right.
So they're actively operating
Okay.
today.
Okay.
As I understand it. Do you have specific information about classical light?
Well, they came in and
They came
talked to us about some of the challenges that
They have?
some Linden residents have with their business.
Okay.
And I know you work mostly with businesses that have just left.
I do, but other people I work with
Right.
active industries. And
So
do they have, what kind of problems do they have with the community?
Well, you know how you were saying you can allow a little bit of pollution to come out, right? Well, what they were finding is that that little bit of pollution was, over a long period of time, was making people sick. And so we've had, like we said, some of the students did some research and were on, presented that information on the radio. And one of the things was that there's a lot of cancer going on in Linden, right? And so some of the activists that one of our students interviewed said that, well, what's happening is that people are getting sick over a little bit of pollution over a long period of time.
Well, one of the things is the exposure time. I know we have risk assessors that evaluate, we assume a 30-year exposure time. That's kind of an adult exposure time. So it depends if it's adult or child. There are different ways of looking at risk. And you're right, the health effects are really the Department of Health who would evaluate, is there a cancer cluster here? If so, then they would come back to us and let's find out what could be causing this. There are some cancer clusters that, they're not sure. We have an area, not in my district, but another district. There's a town that has landfills and has a factory there that continues to discharge today and historically had a landfill. There's a higher incident of certain types of cancer there, but they're not sure what's causing it, which is kind of frustrating. They keep trying to study what could be causing this problem, and the Department of Health says, well, we have a cancer cluster. It's statistically significant, meaning that there are enough cases that it's not normal for this to occur. But what's causing it? They haven't figured out a source. So sometimes it's difficult to link, you know, a contaminant to cancer. It's difficult to have enough data to be able to do that. I mean, today, everyone fills their car with gasoline, right?
Right.
Well, gasoline has benzene in it, which is a cancer causer. Used to have lead in it. It doesn't have lead anymore, but we're exposed to those things every day. People who smoke also have an increased rate of cancer. So there are things in the environment that seems to be acceptable, but can also cause adverse health effects.
Are you okay with us transitioning down
Sure.
to the students?
Yeah.
If anybody find, oh, go ahead.
Can I mention Magnetic Springs? Mention the other two sites. Magnetic Springs is a
Oh,
site.
also on Joyce.
Also on
Magnetic
Joyce.
Springs,
Yeah, and they produce water
Yeah.
for drinking. They were permitted by us to install a well. Now the production is commercial production, and it's regulated by the Department of Agriculture. So it is a regulated site for the production of that drinking water. And the last one you had was a Norse Dairy.
Yeah.
And I believe there is a surface water permit for that site and possibly an air permit.
So that means that they're also releasing some kind
They're
of toxin.
operating, right, but it's within an acceptable range. That they have to buy, you know, they look at it on a community-wide basis a lot of time, or watershed basis. So there's a certain threshold that can be released. So it depends on many industries in the area too. It's not just one industry. So yeah, I'm willing to take questions on, that you might have.
So anybody, you either find the question that you asked, or you just see something on there that's interesting, go ahead and shoot. We want to make sure we get as many of these questions answered as possible. Who would like to start off? Lynette.
I'm gonna do it.
You wanna start off?
In what ways do you track and manage hazardous waste?
That's a good question. We have a division of materials and waste management. And for sites that are actively using hazardous substances and create hazardous waste, they have permits and requirements on where they can store that material, where it has to be disposed of at the end of the day. It's tracked. There's a lot of paperwork involved, and there are permits associated with that. I may look at sites where they had a pad where they'd store the materials, and then they remove those when they're done. What we do, we may look underneath that pad to see if there was ever a spill there. They're required to report spills today, but historically, there may have been releases that were not reported.
Okay.
But that is something what we do regulate, the hazardous substances, hazardous waste, and they're all defined in different laws and rules. Does anyone else have a question?
Why doesn't the EPA think MMA is harmful?
MMA, well, we can go to what that is. I did look it up on the website. I really can't speak to why we don't think it's harmful, but I did find there is information on the US EPA's website that describes the health effects from MMA and what it might,
This one here?
let's see. Yeah, we can go to that one. This is EPA, this is the US EPA website, and MMA is methyl and it tells you there's a hazard summary, and even in 1992, it was determined to be. It's manufactured for resins and plastics. It is an irritant, skin, eyes, mucous membranes. There can be an allergic respiratory component there.
So this MMA is what, Ms. Anderson told us Plascolite is released.
That's what they release. It does say they consider it not likely to be a carcinogenic to human. So it's more of an acute effect that may cause, problems with your eyes and skin. It may be an irritant, but they don't think it causes cancer. So it's not a long-term effect, it's a short-term acute effect, we would call it.
If you all remember, I know y'all saw some of the Gloria Anderson interview, but one thing she said was that there's been tests only on rats.
A lot of times, the agency does extrapolate from rats. They don't necessarily want to test on humans. It may take time, it may be toxic. So a lot of times they will look at rat studies. That's one of the ways that they evaluate the toxicity of chemicals. And that's something the US EPA is involved in. You can see what else is down here. So that there are links to all sorts of information about this on here. And it tells you, see, we mentioned acute effects. It tells you what those are. Chronic effects may deal with respiratory issues. But that's how I would go about looking at that type of chemical. I would look it up and see what does it cause. And then there are ways to prevent exposure to it. I'm sure, let's say a facility is using it, they have OSHA requirements, they call them, Office of Safety Health Administration, where they have to be protecting their workers that are dealing with this chemical. So they may have to wear respirators, they may have gloves they have to wear. Those are things handled by that group, not by Ohio EPA, but by OSHA. So there are probably standards that would be required to handle that material.
If you remember, Anderson was saying how people continue to get asthma, he's talking about that respiratory thing, people in that area.
And that they may be a sensitive population, they may be more sensitive to this than others. So that could happen.
Who else has a question? And if you don't, you can just read anyone that's on there. Julia, read a question for us.
I think we still have a little time, don't we? Yeah. Oh.
A 2013 report stated that the risks associated with air pollution are higher in Ohio counties with a larger minority population and low incomes. Can you tell us about why you think that is?
Why I think that is that Columbus or?
Ohio counties.
I think you would have to look at where factories are located. There may be discharges, factories may be isolated in a certain part of town historically, because there may have been property available. I know on the south end of Columbus, I had a number of glass manufacturing sites, and historically they use lead in their process and this, but that's where the factory set up, that's where their workers were, and it just happened on that side of town is where a lot of that activity occurred. You have areas that have grown into more residential areas, less factories there, so there could be a difference regionally with where those types of contaminants might occur.
What federal agencies do the Ohio EPA work with?
We work with a number of federal agencies, the US EPA being one of them. We also work with the health department, the local health departments, the state health department. Other federal agencies, I think there's the wildlife, natural resources. When we deal with a damage assessment, we work with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We work with the Army Corps of Engineers. I have a site where there are wetlands involved, federally jurisdictional wetlands, meaning that that's something that they permit. They had to get permits to sample the areas, and if they impact them, they may have to restore the wetlands to their natural state or create wetlands somewhere else.
Where does the EPA get their money to fund their companies?
That's a good question. Where does the money come from? Well, I mentioned permits. That's one source of revenue. That the industries that are seeking permits would pay a fee. In case of the voluntary action program, there are fees for submitting like the no further action letter to us. It's established in rule how much money they have to pay for that. They also can voluntarily pay us our actual costs for providing technical assistance. There's some grant money available that comes from the federal government. With our hazardous waste program, there are tipping fees, meaning a fee that someone would pay to dispose of a material in the landfill. Part of that is used for funding our agency. And then federal grants come in to provide technical assistance to different communities, different cities. So we do have that available. We're doing less with state funding. There's a, when you pay your taxes, it goes into a state fund. We're less and less focused on that and more on recovering costs. When I work at a site that's under an order, meaning we've kind of come to a company and found that they're responsible for cleaning up, they would have to pay us. We'd actually come to an agreement where they pay us for our costs. What it costs to investigate the site, what it costs to oversee the cleanup of that site, and any legal costs they would be responsible for. So we do have sites that the polluter has to pay for. Hopefully that answers your question on funding. Do we have any questions over here?
How do you enhance community engagement?
Community engagement. A number of ways that we do that. I have a site in Westerville, in fact, where we have public meetings. We kind of put in the paper, we're going to have a meeting, we send out emails to people in the community. This site happens to be near a residential neighborhood, so there's a lot of people whose fences kind of go up to the back of this property. So they're concerned about what's going on there, and we share information with them. When we came up with a cleanup plan, we will meet with them and take their comments. So they actually have input into the process on what's going to happen at that site. We call it community involvement. So there are other areas that have a technical community involvement board. So that is something that, depending on the site and the requirements, there are requirements to comply with getting community input. And usually you'll end up with a better solution that way too. People know what's going on there, they understand what's happening, what the options, what was evaluated, why did the agency pick this one to clean up the site as opposed to something else. And they have input in that process.
Can you tell us the difference between a hazardous waste dump and a hazardous waste collection facility?
Okay, a hazardous waste collection facility, as I understand.
Because some of us will be traveling to one locally.
Oh, great. There may be a center where, let's say you have a hazardous waste drop-off day. They may collect paints and other hazardous waste for disposal. So it's like a temporary storage facility where they will process it and then take it to a licensed and permitted disposal facility where the hazardous waste would be disposed. It may also be treated somehow before they take it there to make it less toxic, less hazardous. So they can turn actually a hazardous waste into a non-hazardous waste, which would be a solid waste usually, or repurpose it, like in the case of paint. They may blend the paint and then reuse the paint instead of disposing of it. So there are different options for addressing hazardous waste, solid waste.
Are there any possible negative health effects with a collection site?
I'm sure there's potential for exposure, so the people handling the waste would have to know what the materials are and have protective equipment so they know how to handle it and what not to put next to other things. I know at some of those hazardous waste days that I've read about that people bring in materials like old munitions, let's say, and those could be dangerous on their own, maybe unstable. So they could bring something in that's not stable, and they'd have to handle it properly. They put it into a container that can keep it safe. So that is their techniques to do that.
What is the e-manifest tracking system?
Email fast tracking system. I believe that has something to do with permits. Like I said, I don't do a lot with permits. I think there is a way on our website to look into those issues, fast tracking permits.
If you want to learn about a place that may be hazardous, that might be next to your home or next to your school, you can go to this e-manifest tracking system and look for those things right there.
That could be, yeah. Having an address would help with looking it up. We have people you can contact that maintain databases of these old sites. So on our website, there's a link there that you can send an email to someone and request information. There's always the ability to do a public records request. So we have files that are available to the public. You just have to contact us and let us know what you want to look at, when you want to do it. And you come in and you can look through the files. You can even have copies made of some of the files too. So it's a good resource if you're interested in finding out more about a site.
How do you ensure that a place like Linden is safe and healthy?
Safe and healthy? Well, if we get reports, I work with people who are emergency responders. They work, let's say there's a spill, we have a hotline, a 1-800 number that you call, you report this spill, and then we have someone look into it. And if it needs an emergency response, they coordinate with the fire department and the appropriate people. They may get a contractor to address if there's a release of contamination. A lot of times when there's a fire or a truck dumps its load on one of the highways, they're involved in checking out what material leaked from the truck. You know, did it get into a waterway? If it got into a waterway, then we have to stop it from moving from that waterway and clean it up. So that's one way that we ensure that people are safe. As far as Linden itself, we're obviously looking at the industries in the area. We have active sites there that are ongoing, and we provide oversight of those to make sure they're complying with their permit requirements.
So one of the major ways to make sure that the community is safe is from the people in the community telling you.
Yes.
So you rely on,
Reporting, yes.
so we have to report to you.
That's always an option that's available. The sooner we find out about something, the faster it can be addressed. Could you say that again?
What is the IRS program?
The IRIS program?
IRIS.
IRIS. Yeah, I believe that's called IRIS. I think we have an example of going to IRIS. It's a database for chemicals and risk factors. It says IRIS here. Here we go. Right here.
This one?
Substances, yeah. IRIS, is that?
Yep.
Okay. Here's IRIS, the Integrated Risk Information System. So that's a US EPA website that you can look up chemicals, and it gives you all the information you want to know about it. You mentioned rat studies before. I think this is an area you can find that information. These are all risk-related information about health effects, doses. So when I work with risk assessors, they call people who are trained to evaluate this data. They may be a toxicologist, a scientist, and they use this information in evaluating risk from chemicals. So this links to all sorts of reports and data that anything you want to know about that chemical.
Can you go back up to the top?
Yep. Maybe go to IRIS here. This is just one of the summaries for. You can search keywords. You can. There we go. And it has the most viewed chemicals, and you were mentioning some on here already.
So you can go on the EPA site, we have, like Mr. Roth was saying, we have a number of businesses along Joyce.
Yes.
And like Norris Dairy, we know that they have a permit, which means that they release some things. It'll be good to say, what do they have a permit for? What are they releasing into our neighborhood? Even though it might be a little bit. What are the health risks? And we can go to this site, the IRIS site, and see what those chemicals might be doing to.
And I guess you have to be aware that a release, their permit may be for a year-long average. So a release at one time with wind still may be noticeable, and other times not as noticeable. But you look over the whole year, you know, what type of exposure you're getting from that source over the year. So there are odors now, odor complaints which would probably go to the Department of Health, of local health department. And we get those too for landfills. Sometimes they're not always the best smelling areas. We try to control that.
How do you make sure your data is readily available for us to read?
That's a good question. We're working on that. Having a website has been helpful. We try to get data and letters and all that. We're working to become more electronic, so it's easier to provide. I mentioned we have the ability to allow you to look at our files and share data that way. And we have reports that come out every year too that give summaries of data. We do have some toxicologists and fish, people who study fish and toxic effects in different basins, and they'll write up a report for each of those areas to assess the conditions there. So that's certainly one of the active data sharing projects that we have.
Was there anything that wasn't clear to anybody, or you have a new question that you want to ask? So can we look at that closing part too? Like a total closing question for us. Beyonce?
How will the Ohio EPA build a strong partnership with communities in Columbus like Linden?
Well, I think being involved by listening to the community when like for example, we have news clips. We have clippings from the newspaper that we look at every day. So if there's an issue that's being discussed in the community that has to do with environment, we may be aware of that. We have local people contact us about that. We have reporters come in when there's a story like that. So we're aware of it, and we share that information so we can get everyone who knows about that to come forward and share information about that site. If there's community public meetings, I know we're involved with those. We create our own. Sometimes there's a request from the community. We public notice if there's a permit going out, for example. And you have the ability to write comments about that permit, or a meeting could be held too to share your comments. So we do seek public input on those issues.
Another closing question? Lori? Go ahead, read it.
How?
Okay. Go ahead.
How would you propose to revitalize it?
Let me see if I understand. How to revitalize your community?
So, if we have with the stormwater permits and the industries and various things that are being released in the neighborhood, what would you say, what advice would you give us to address some of those things?
Well, if you see an area that's fenced off and has a sign that says keep out, maybe we'd have an understanding why it's necessary to stay out of there. There could be chemicals that you don't want to be exposed to in that area. There may be signage requirements. They may be treating that material before it leaves the site. So staying out of that area would be important to prevent exposure to those chemicals. I think being aware, if you see a fire that is releasing clouds, to stay away from that area, because there may be some exposure from the smoke and whatever might be in the smoke. Leave that to the professionals to address, and just stay back to protect yourself.
And remember that all this information is here for you to read. If you don't know what that is, you have a question about why do they want me to keep out? What is it? What's behind that fence that might be dangerous? We've been exposed to some websites, and I can post that on our Facebook page. Hopefully some of you have liked it. I'll post those links up there. If you ever have any questions, you want to say, hey, well, I don't know why this business is here, or what they might be releasing, or why they want me to keep out. You can ask. You can ask the business itself. You can go and look on the EPA site. You can email Mr. Roth. Or the EPA is there for you.
And they may have on the sign, they may have a rule cited that will give you more information about what the reasoning is.
Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
What advice would you give us about how to be good environmental leaders in our community?
I would say get informed, which I think you're already doing, having speakers come into you and talk about your community and what's there. You know, stay up with the news, see what's going on.
Don't be scared to research. and
That's
ask
right,
questions.
research. Having the computer is a wonderful tool if you know how to use it, so that can be good. And just, you know, to keep yourself educated and informed, I think is important. If there's something you're interested in, do a little more research and see if you can find out more about it. Ask your teachers.
And sometimes we don't know, so we have to bring in experts.
We don't always have the answers, but, you know, we try to find other people who do have information to share. So we all have our certain expertise, I guess. We usually have a team of people involved, so we have different perspectives, different information, and that does help solve problems.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rock. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you all so much. Y'all can keep your sheets with you. Bring them